Well, hello and thank you for joining me for another Alex on Tech and iTWireTV interview. I'm joined today by Michael McKinnon. He's the CIO of Tesserent. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Alex. Pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. Now, Tesserent is described as Australia's largest ASX-listed cybersecurity company. But I guess the best thing is, can you please tell us a bit about the history of Tesserent and the products and services that it's offering to Australians and to the world market today?
Absolutely. So look, as you said, Tesserent is Australia's largest ASX-listed cybersecurity firm. We really pride ourselves as being an Australian sovereign nation cybersecurity company. We really are an end-to-end provider of everything cybersecurity, and we use a term sometimes called from the boardroom to the basement, which kind of explains, what we do with businesses, where we want to help them with their board, and we want to help them with their C-level executives and their top management, right the way down to the nitty-gritty technical aspects of really what's required to implement a solid cybersecurity plan. And so we do that by helping out with managed services. We work with a bunch. We employ one of the largest team of ethical hackers in the country who just love rolling their sleeves up and just getting into systems and finding those vulnerabilities. We've got business advisors and cybersecurity advisors who work with financial reporting frameworks and cybersecurity frameworks and all this exciting stuff. So, cybersecurity, it's just such a fantastic business to be in. And as a business, Tesserent has grown enormously. We were number 2 on the AFR Top 100 list just recently, just to give you an idea of the sort of growth that we're seeing at the moment.
Sure. Now, today is World Backup Day, and I'm sure people will be watching this after World Backup Day. I like to say that every day should be World Backup Day. It's important because we've got never before levels of cyber Cold War going on. We have an actual war going on in Europe. And cyber criminals, of course, I think in some Batman movie was the phrase, chaos is a ladder. Well, don't the bad guys know that? They always talk about how in recessions that the criminals and the prostitution and the alcohol and cigarettes, all that goes really well, but everyone else is doing badly. And it's the same in the modern world. The cyber criminals are going great guns. I mean, it's not about if you'll be infected, or attacked, it's when. And of course, for companies, it's how many times per second you're being attacked these days. So, what threats are businesses facing today, and what are your customers asking for help with against that crazy backdrop?
Yeah, absolutely. Look. I mean, with World Backup Day, I mean, you made a great point there. It's like every day should be Backup Day, right? And I've got some great friends in IT, and one of my friends who I really respect and admire, he has this saying: you either back up or you don't back up. Like there's no in between ground on this. And unfortunately, if you're not doing a good job at backing up, you will find out the hard way eventually. And to talk about cybercrime and just this ever-increasing threat landscape that we're seeing as technologies get more complex and complicated, and that has kind of included this whole notion of what we need to do in an IT sense of backing up. The art of backup has become just so complicated and so complex. And there's a whole bunch of reasons that are tied directly to the cyber crime aspect of this. So where we've got threat actors out there who are infecting systems or getting into systems to put ransomware, which is just proving over the years to just be this most incredibly effective attack for cyber criminals and just so incredibly destructive for businesses. There are some scary stats. I mean, it's really hard to get an idea of the actual statistics around ransomware because there's a lot of vendors involved. They're doing their own research and they're often coming up with different answers. But you'll read research that indicates, scarily enough, in some parts of the world, that as many as 60% of businesses who are impacted by ransomware are actually paying the ransom, which is horrifying because we would hope that we can work with organizations and get them in a point where they never pay the ransom. And of course, if you've got good backups and you've got a good system that's working for you, then you don't have to pay the ransom. But yeah, coming back to your question around the threat landscape and what we're seeing, it's just this ever increasing ransomware threat. And then on top of that, a lot of the ransomware threat actor groups now have been really using this method called double extortion. And so what they're doing is they're also stealing some of the data. And if you don't pay the ransom, they'll then say to you, well, we're also going to put this information on the dark web, or we'll release it publicly and embarrass you that way if you don't pay the ransom. So they're trying to, ramp up the ante to get their payday. But then there are other things then you need to look at the business around how you protect the data breach scenario and kind of fortify your defenses, and also be a bit more resilient to identify if they do get through the front door, that you can kick them out as quickly as possible without them walking out with some of your data as well.
Yeah, and the ransomware attack guys and girls are attacking backups. So obviously must have been a huge focus for companies to protect those backups, to make sure that they haven't been encrypted. But I guess the question is, how many companies are testing their backups to see how quickly they can recover from that, the whole disaster recovery scenario? Because in these days, you don't want to be offline for even a second if you can avoid it, because that can add to millions of dollars. And, traditionally restoring is not quick. So what's the scenario there? I mean, how does Tesserent help companies to make sure that they're backed up, then they're testing the backups, and then they simulate an entire meltdown to see how quickly they can get back up online?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, one of the important things that businesses need to be looking at is really this notion of having immutable backups. Now, an immutable backup is where you've stored your data in some location or place that cannot be changed by people who have ordinary access to your IT environment. That just kind of makes sense when you think about it, but it's just surprising how many organizations haven't quite got there yet. So one of the ways that sometimes the cyber crooks can get into your business is through credential theft. So they might have somehow phished through a phishing attack, or tricking a system administrator into their getting their password, or maybe even compromising their mobile phone, and even being able to bypass things like multi-factor authentication. And there are some techniques where that's possible. So what we don't want to see happen is the system administrator's credentials, which are also used in the system that's holding the backups, gets infiltrated, and then the ransomware actors can delete all of that information. So you've got to have this sense of immutable backup that also doesn't use the same authentication domain, authentication realm that could get the attackers in there as well. And so we often find, and I think we, as providers of cloud backup solutions ourselves for a lot of our enterprise clients, we set them up with a completely separate authentication realm. We partner with them, and they essentially give us then the responsibility and accountability around being able to access that backup environment, and no one else can, right? So you have this sort of nice separation. Now, the other challenging thing with backups around testing them is that it takes a lot of effort to, if you're backing up entire virtual servers, or you've got these enormous images, these can be, hundreds of gigabytes in some cases, depending on the infrastructure that's being backed up. And so in order to be able to test those backups, you need to be able to have an environment with enough capacity to restore those hundreds of gigabytes of backups, and then test them and maybe fire, so you need some sort of lab test environment. And a lot of organizations just aren't willing to invest in all of that extra infrastructure to be able to do that. So partnering with an organization like Tesserent that can manage that sort of cloud backup process at that enterprise scale means that you've got this ability now to have someone else just run the program and report back and say, yes, the backups are working fine. But there's that capacity to be able to unpack those backups and actually check that they are, that they have the integrity you need to. Now, the other thing about restoring from backups that becomes a problem during a ransomware infection, a lot of people forget this, because a lot of people think, oh, well, I'll get ransomwared, that's the term, ransomware, and we'll have this impact. Now, the question is always around timing, and I can tell you that with almost certainty, if you are going to be impacted by ransomware, it's likely to be 8 o'clock on a Friday night or 2 or 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Right? They're the kind of two often sort of time peaks we see. So it's always a weekend problem that you're dealing with, and that sort of creates a whole bunch of problems in itself. But yeah, there is just so much to consider. And then the other thing too is that if the ransomware infection takes hold on that weekend time frame, the threat actors have probably been in your network, and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre will tell us from their statistics that Threat actors in a ransomware case are usually in the environment. They've hacked in and found some backdoor access for between 10 to 30 days on average before the ransomware infection is kicked off, right? So this means your backups for at least a month beforehand are potentially compromised, and some of the machine images could be infected. So now you've got a problem where if you're trying to restore your environment from backups, you've potentially dealing with a whole complex scenario of how you restore these images over this 30-day time frame, and then you've got to start reaching back into 60, 90 days beforehand and try and identify when was the point of intrusion and when can we actually trust our backups. And so that whole notion then of having that test environment and that capacity to extract all of those large backups and then sift through them, like you just can't do that on your own. You need help to be able to do that.
And of course, that you're dealing with the loss of 30, 60, 90 days of data, which can cripple a business. Potentially,
yeah. And look, and hopefully, because the ransomware usually kicks off, we become aware that pretty quickly. We can usually recover the data, but the problem is it's those little tools that the attackers have left behind, opening up potential backdoors and ways of reinfection. So you'll get a situation where you don't pay the ransom, and they just come in and encrypt everything again. Like you spend all that time restoring, and then they just come and hit you again and try for a second time or a third time.
And this is where they say that the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Because, I mean, how can disaster recovery be fast in that sort of scenario where you've got to sift through all that data? It must take, I mean, we saw with the Channel 9 hack from last year, that took them quite a while before they managed to get back on TV pretty quickly, but the ramifications were reverberating for weeks, if not longer.
Yeah, exactly. Look, in terms of incident response, we do a lot of incident response with organisations. I've worked very heavily with a number of very large organisations over the past couple of years, particularly through COVID. It got really bad. We saw a real ramp up of this sort of activity. And one of the things that takes a lot of time initially in an incident and responding to an incident is identification and detection of the actual threat. And so you're trying to find little pieces of the malware left behind, sifting through artifacts in different log files, and then trying to sort of piece together what's actually happened here, what sort of access did the threat actor get to the environment. And that's the initial thing that takes time. But if you've then got a solid backup plan that's been working efficiently and has been tested, then the whole restoration process is just made so much more easier from that point onwards.
Yeah. Now, Tesserent and I guess other companies in the same space must have quite a detailed, plan for new customers to onboard them and to go through everything that you need to go through. And that must be, obviously you're starting a multi-year relationship that is going to be, very deep. And every company is different, but what's the short version of the sort of things that you will sit down and talk about a customer with on that journey to getting them as protected as possible?
Yeah, so look, the really good thing about where we find ourselves now with technology and particularly around backups is that there's no shortage of choice of tools and platforms available that can cover you for backing up on-premise data, hybrid cloud environments, private cloud environments, public cloud environments. There is just no shortage of being able to find the right solution. So often with backup, it's trying to work out, how do we do this in a smart way, without having to do too much work. Because I can tell you one thing is a commercial reality about backup. No company spends $1 more than they need to on backups, right? Because
they probably spend many dollars more than they need to on recovering. They should be spending all that money on recovering on backups. That will save a lot of time and money.
Yeah, correct. And I think what happens is it's really interesting when you're running a business because you've got all these competing priorities. You've got an IT budget that's already, overflowing across the edges because you need the next, endpoint security solution. You need the next, next gen firewalls and all the other things that you might be investing in, and cloud and multi-cloud, and it's just becoming so complicated, right? And so, the sad reality is that for many organizations, the whole disaster recovery backup processes and policies a kind of push down the end of a very long list of other super important stuff that also needs to be done, right? Mm-hmm. So what we do is we work with our clients and we try and get sort of this pragmatic view of, what does your environment look like? What technologies have you got? Where does the data live? Do you have a cybersecurity framework which has already identified the importance of your data? So looking at things like data classification policies and these sorts of things, understanding what the retention policy needs are for your business. So, if you're in a financial, business, if you're an accounting firm or a law firm, you have regulatory requirements to keep information for a certain period of time. Same goes for health providers. But then there are other businesses, retail businesses and so forth that, maybe their financial data will be stored for longer, but other stuff is just not relevant, after a certain period of time. So we really work with organizations to understand what does your data actually look like? Mm-hmm. What are the most important bits that need to be restored? And that also might sort of trigger off. And often what will happen then is once you start digging that deep into an organization, you'll find that they've probably neglected this for a number of years. And then there's a need for sort of transforming parts of the business. So we know, for example, that backing up virtual machines is a lot easier than backing up bare metal hardware. Mm. So and restoring is far easier as well. So we might go through a program then of recommending and suggesting that we start to do some sort of digital transformation activities. Maybe it's not virtualization on premise. Maybe it's a push into public cloud environments where when they're engineered and working well, they can be just as secure as on-prem solutions as well. And then across all of that, we work out then, okay, what does the backup process look like? What does the restoration process look like? And how can we be on standby for that? I like to use the airline, hostess approach, which is in the unlikely event of a ransomware incident. Yeah. We're here to help you.
Brace position, brace.
Correct.
Now, we can't go past the discussion about World Backup Day without talking about the 3-2-1 backup rule. 3 copies of your data on 2 physical mediums in 1 offsite location, which in the age of multi-cloud environments and nobody using CDs or DVDs anymore, only businesses still using tapes. I mean, it sounds extremely archaic and out of date. So I always say to people, look, if you've got really important data, copy it to multiple cloud locations and multiple, mediums, SSDs and hard disks and other things. So how would you update and modernize the 3-2-1 backup rule for the 2020s?
So I think the 3-2-1 backup rule is still a really good guide for businesses to follow. So in a modern world where we've got cloud, and I think one of the dangers that can happen here is you've sort of said, well, if we have this notion of doing backups in the cloud, we could just go crazy and just like make all sorts of copies, right? But the whole 3-2-1 rule kind of tells us we want 3 copies of something. And I can tell you there are dangers to being a little bit too over-enthusiastic in doing backups. Because if you start going crazy and backing up, I'll put it onto this external hard drive and take that home with me, and I'll put it in the cloud, and I'll put it in 4 different cloud accounts and whatever. And I can tell you what will happen. You'll start paying a lot of money for online storage in a whole bunch of different places, and then you start to quickly lose track of the data that you're backing up. And you'll sort of then there's this fear of, should I let that data go? Because maybe it's still important to me. And so you've got to be careful not to overinvest in a backup solution. And I think it's better to, I almost think of the tradies approach, which is measure twice, cut once.
Yeah.
And so with backup, what you want to do is really look very carefully at the solution and just invest all of your effort and energy into a backup solution that is tested and works properly, rather than just getting into this sort of false economy of spreading your data everywhere, because you'll just make the situation worse and more complicated than it needs to be.
And it's also in multiple places that could be hacked in different ways. Yeah. You've got to watch out for that too.
I think it comes back to that important fact that I talked about earlier, which is this immutability of the backup. Really what you want to do is, first of all, make sure you're backing up the right data that can restore your business. So that's sort of identifying the right data. And then when you do back it up, making sure it's in an environment that is not accessible to the threat actors if they do get in, and then working with a partner to be able to restore in an efficient and easy manner to get the business back up and going.
Now, as we get towards the end of the interview, I always just like to ask a bunch of questions about yourself. And the first one is, what's a bit about your own personal history in the world of tech? So what got you interested and involved in the tech space?
Yeah, so look, I'm a nerd at heart. I have been involved with computers since I was a teenager in my bedroom at home, and everything in my career since has involved technology and computers. So, it's just sort of who I am. I also sort of had a keen interest. My dad is a seasoned electronics technician, so I spent a lot of my childhood, soldering circuit boards and pulling things apart and doing all that kind of stuff as well. So yeah, keen interest in everything technology, really. Where I found my career kind of heading was initially into IT operations back in the days when we had mainframes in big rooms, and then I sort of went through that whole PC era, went through the whole multimedia era, sort of through the whole internet era, and ended up becoming a sort of an internet application developer. So I ended up writing a lot of internet applications, a lot of applications for businesses, and what happened actually, my interest in cybersecurity came about because I'd written a really large e-commerce platform for a large global company, and it got hacked. And some crooks got in and they were stealing credit card numbers. And I went through this whole process of working with this third-party company that came in, and we were working through the incident response. And I was like, wow, this is just amazing. And I was so livid that the crooks got into the environment that I'd built. I really felt insulted by that, and that really kicked off my deep interest in cybersecurity, and it just went from there. And now I just love working with businesses and organizations of all sizes just to help spread the awareness of what's going on and just how to prevent a lot of the bad stuff that can happen.
And I always like to ask, what is a memory you can share of your first computer? And do you remember the first time that you personally were attacked by some sort of virus? I mean, I remember way back in the DOS days, I went to some friend's place and I brought a disk over or something, and they had a disk, and next thing their computer, their hard disk was wiped. I mean, this was in the DOS days. It was some sort of malicious virus way back then. But what was your first computer, and what's your first virus memory?
My first computer was a Dick Smith VZ200,
yeah.
which was this tiny little. I must have been maybe 12 or 13, maybe something like that. And I remember it plugged in. You didn't have a computer monitor. I think I might have even been a little black and white TV.
Yeah.
And I plugged in the
RCA
maybe it was
socket.
RCA,
Yeah, that's what it
or
was.
maybe it was even the antenna tuner. I can't even recall.
Yeah,
And I remember it had some sort of memory expansion pack. I think on the side. I think it was like 16 kilobytes. Which is like, whoa, 16 kilobytes.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And I remember the keyboard was that one of those rubber calculator type keyboards.
Yeah.
And you could hold a function key or a shift sort of a shift key, and you could, instead of typing the A through Z characters, you could type like different sort of symbols, and you could sort of make pictures and things like that. And I was sort of writing like a number guessing game in BASIC and doing that kind of stuff. I sort of then went on to an Amiga 500 and others. But my first interaction with a bit of malware or virus was a similar experience to yours. Actually, I was at a friend's house. His older sister was at university, and they had a PC. A PC. It was like an 8086 PC. It was amazing at the time. And and it was on a floppy disk, and something had happened. She'd been trading the disks around at uni, and she came home, and I was there with my friend, and we were looking at a computer, and it said, your computer is stoned. It was the classic. It was the stoned virus, and it was a boot sector virus.
Yeah.
And it just wrote itself onto, you then put another disk in, and it wrote itself to to that disk, and it just spread from disk to disk. And then I just sort of, then it was just on, right? Because then Amiga, there were viruses on Amiga platform, and then it sort of spread like wildfire. But it certainly picked up a lot more in the Windows days, and lots of issues we see continuing on today.
Yeah, it's incredible how it's grown and affecting people's phones and all sorts of stuff. But look, from the past to the future, how do you think the cybersecurity industry will look in the 2030s when, in theory, the metaverse will be something that we're all living in, and people may even have brain chips that are somehow attacked by ransomware to put people into digital comas?
Yeah. Look, I think anything is possible with that. I think that if you look, if I think about cyber crime and cybersecurity, really what we're talking about is crime that has existed forever, right? Societies grow and get to a certain size. There are inequities in wealth and successes in life, and then there are people who are less fortunate who then take advantage. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. You know, I often think that a lot of the tech support call scams and things that we see from other countries are often a result of this indifference between economic circumstances, that you've got other countries that are far less fortunate than us that build these industries around then scamming the richer countries to get some of that money, right? So I think there's sort of a lot of interesting angles to look at this around what underpins cybercrime, so you can sort of understand it from that perspective. There are some people that work in those tech support call centers don't even know they're working for a scam operation, right? Yeah. It's a commercial business for them. So there's different ways of looking at this, but I think what ultimately comes back to is it's either financial greed or the ability to change your financial circumstances by somehow tricking someone else through social engineering, you know. And when we talk about cybersecurity, the other interesting thing that people forget about is we talk about technology preventing all sorts of nasty things from happening, but humans are at the center of technology, and as humans we have vulnerabilities. And so when we look at risks for a business, and we look at, well, it could be malware that will affect you, or it could be a vulnerability because you didn't update some application that might be a vulnerability. But humans and the ability to execute tactics of social engineering that is tricking us humans, because our brains have all sorts of cognitive quirks that are blind spots to dealing with us. That's I think really interesting. I think human behavior is sort of a bit of a constant here. And yeah, you know, we look at what social media can do to the human brain. We look at studies around a thing called Google Brain, which is that a lot of young people nowadays no longer need to retain the information. They just need to retain the knowledge of where to find the information. So you remember, I remember seeing that on a website. So you don't need to remember what was on the website, but you know the information you're looking for was on that particular website, right? So our ability even to store information in our own brains has changed even in the last couple of decades. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating when we do see those sort of brain interfaces come about and some of those other things happen, I think. But I think ultimately it's going to come back to definitely us and what's the impact on us as citizens of nations that are protecting wealth, as people who want to protect our own families' well-being and interests. And this is where it gets really, really hairy and really scary as well to think about, cyber war and aspects of that. And we see, of course, what's happening in Europe at the moment around aspects where this is the fifth domain. Military for years have used this notion of air, sea, land, space. And cyberspace is absolutely one of those battlegrounds where there's a lot of stuff happening, and nation-state sponsored actors doing all sorts of nefarious things online. We're just having to deal with all of that, and then we're trying to run our businesses and make livelihoods and live in our societies and prosper as well. So very interesting times, Alex.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, with all that social engineering, we all know that famous phrase: "You are the weakest link."
Yeah, correct.
So, as my second last question is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received to help you get where you are today?
That is a fantastic question, Alex. I think there are two things that stand out for me. I met a successful business person when I was probably around 20 years of age, and he wrote, I think I'd actually just lost my job. I was doing some job, and I think I tried to do a sales role or something, and as a techie that just didn't work out. And I remember losing that job, and I was sort of in a bit of a disarray. I didn't know what I wanted to do really, and I met this sort of mentor, and he wrote down on this bit of paper. I used to carry it in my wallet, but it's sort of disappeared probably a decade ago now, and it basically said, "Begin with the end in mind." And I always remember that, begin with the end in mind. And I think that one of the things we often forget, like you go into a meeting, for example, and often no one has really defined what are we trying to achieve in this meeting? What's the outcome? And so I've used that through my career the whole time, is to think about what's the outcome, what's the end goal we're looking for, what's the so what of why we should be doing what we're doing. So that's kind of one thing. And then the other thing I learned probably about a decade after that, when I was probably in my early 30s, was from another very successful business guy who was a bit of a crazy cat, but it was, and I made this one up. It's not what basically I learned this from working with him. This is not something he said to me, but it's basically the term, everything is negotiable. right? He had this amazing way of just getting his own way, and I think that there are potentially negative aspects of that. If you don't want to be a corporate bully, you don't want to strong arm people into doing things that they don't want to be doing. So you've got to have some integrity about what you do and some ethics. But this notion of everything is integrity, everything is negotiable, is that if someone says no, just think, is there another win-win scenario I can come up with here that I can work around this to achieve the same thing? And I can tell you, as a CIO and negotiating with vendors and trying to work out how to contribute to an IT ecosystem and build an enterprise that way, this is a very, very valuable talent to have.
So my final question is, what is your final message to iTWire viewers and readers, and to your current and future customers and partners?
I think I'll keep this simple. Computers are hard. Cybersecurity is harder. And you need to keep your wits about you and have a plan, and you need diligence. It's all about dotting the I's and crossing the T's with cybersecurity, because we also have this notion of asymmetry in security. And what this refers to is the fact that if you're running a business and you're trying to defend that business from cyber attack, you have to get everything right. And the attacker only has to find one chink in your armor to actually get through and have some impact. So the businesses that we see today that are really successful in defending themselves, and not only defending themselves, but building a program where they're also resilient, they accept and acknowledge the fact that a cyber attacker on occasion is going to get through those defenses. And then it's about how you detect and respond in a very quick way so that you can stop the bad thing from unfolding. And that, to get to that point, to get to that level of maturity or cybersecurity posture, as we call it, imagine standing up nice and straight with your shoulders back, to get to a good cybersecurity posture takes a lot of work. You've got to be in the gym working out, in metaphorically, and that's your IT processes, your systems, your policies, and really making sure all of that is working in a seamless way.
Well, Michael McKinnon, CIO of Tesserent, it's been great to talk to you today, to learn a bit more of the behind the scenes, the crazy world that we live in now, and how you're helping companies to deal with it all. So I wish you the best of success, and I hope we can talk again in the future.
Thank you, Alex. It's been a wonderful chat. I've had a great time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.